Would you like to go ahead and get your screen share going just to make sure everything works the way we expect? Awesome. Beautiful. Right, that puts us to exactly 2 o'clock. Welcome everyone. I hope everyone enjoyed the keynote, and we are here for math accessibility, math as language, and I will turn that over to our fabulous presenters.
Thanks so much. I'm Sarah Shunkwiler, and I'm joined today by Mel Rizzuto and Katie Springer. We are course support specialists and instructional designers at Johns Hopkins Whiting School of Engineering. And thanks so much for joining us today to talk about one of our favorite topics, math accessibility. You want to go on to the next one, Mel? Thanks. So the learning objectives today are to reflect upon the importance of accessible math content and equitable access for disabled STEM professionals and students, to describe the challenges of conveying an accurate hierarchy and structure of equations without a visual representation. So if you're not seeing the equation at the same time, that can be challenging. And we also want to describe best practices for providing auditory descriptions of math content. And one thing that we wanted to point out is that although our tips are for students with disabilities, really they support all students. And a lot of times our faculty and even staff and students don't realize how many people may have disabilities, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but it's just important to note that while we're focusing on that, we're really talking about inclusive teaching in so many other ways. And we're talking about taking a proactive approach, because we have certainly done many course retrofits, but our goal is to be more proactive so that we don't have to work with student disability services so much. So if you want to go on to the next one, Mel, we wanted to ask you what accessible math means to you, and you're welcome to unmute and talk, or you're welcome to put that in the chat. I actually don't even have my chat window up, so I should look at that. But for us, it's a proactive approach, like I said. And our definition is that it's compatible with assistive technology and gives an equivalent experience for all students. As I said, benefits all students, but particularly those with disabilities, including neurodivergence, dyslexia, dyscalculia, ADHD, autism, and many others. It promotes understanding and independence, and avoids placing an unnecessary burden on students to request accessible versions and accommodations. So on the next slide, we actually had some quotes from some of my faculty. I'm an instructional designer of engineering classes, but I'm also an engineer who had a disability as an engineer, and I teach chemistry and physics at Johns Hopkins School of Education. So I have experience in kind of all different areas of this. And so these were my engineering faculty who made these comments, but some of these are comments that I also would have made. So we don't have any students with disabilities, and we hear that a lot. We actually do have students with disabilities. They may just not be apparent. And actually, I realized I forgot to do my own visual description, I think, at the beginning. And I try to do that, and sometimes it just slips by. So like I said, I'm Sarah. I'm a middle-aged cisgender white woman wearing glasses, and I have my on-again, off-again hair wrapped in 2 different scarves, one of which is covered in calculus functions, and my fun Frenchy bulldog clip in honor of our Math Madness mascot, who's Mel's Frenchie. And my t-shirt says disabled is not a bad word. Trust me, I know all of them, which I got because one of our other faculty challenged me to own my disability story. So the bad words we know are stigma, bias, ableism, but um, on the wall behind me in my office, I have a quote that says, "Beauty is the first test. There is no permanent place in the world for ugly mathematics." And the no ugly math is fairly large, which was originally a joke with our IT department, but really to us also, it's kind of our mantra for accessible math. So back to comments from instructors though, captions and extra time were the most common accommodations. I wasn't even aware of math accessibility, how to make equations accessible, or why it mattered, which is in bold because that's really important. I was not aware of disability history or inclusive language and the challenges of disclosure. And that was one that I also felt strongly about. High impact math heavy courses were not using accessible equations, which impacted many students. I thought that was insightful. And then I thought making the course accessible was only related to vision problems, not ADHD, dyslexia, and other hidden disabilities. And that was one of my space systems engineering faculty. And I appreciate that now he's really thinking about that in things like directions and a lot of other areas of the course. So thanks, Mel. This is a reflection, kind of like how would you fill in these circles? That on this slide, there are a number of circles which have possible students in our courses. It could be our faculty, it could be our staff. So they have a spotty internet connection. First generation college student, they're neurodiverse, ADHD, autism, or dyslexia, deaf or hard of hearing. They might have a sleeping baby. It's a noisy room. They're recovering from illness. I've had the flu all week, so if I lose my voice, I'll punt it over to Mel, who's also been sick this week. So we're all struggling with that. Caring for older parents, that was me recently because I just spent 6 months in Ohio taking care of my dad on hospice and working from home, working from his home. Depression or new puppy, no sleep. That's also one of my faculty. So some of these are disabilities, but a lot of them are not. And all of these actually would be a reason to use captions. There was a super interesting LinkedIn post this week about the spotty internet connection and why that is really helpful to have captions. So our point is that it's not always students with disabilities, really so many other people benefit as well. And disabilities in STEM are something that is often overlooked in efforts to diversify STEM fields, and diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging efforts often overlook disability as a form of diversity. So disabled STEM professionals are underrepresented in post-secondary degrees awarded, have higher unemployment and underemployment rates across their lifetime. As far as self-identification, 9% of workers in the general population self-identify as disabled, while only 3% of workers in the STEM workforce self-identify as disabled. And one research study I read said that 28% of engineering students self-identified as disabled. It was a small study, but again, it goes back to self-disclosure. So the stigma and burden of disclosure is very real due to stigma and bias. And we also place often an unnecessary burden of disclosure on students to request accommodations. So if we could take a more proactive approach that really supports our Student Disability Services Office and our students. And the reason I remembered to bring up my t-shirt is our engineering faculty really challenged me saying, you're an engineer with a disability, you're a faculty member with a disability, and you're not owning your story to be a role model for our students. So I really have done that in the past year. But I will say that the reason I didn't do that in the past is the stigma and bias that still surrounds disabilities, and mine is chronic illness, but I do think that's still a challenge. So on the next slide, we have a quote, which we use quite frequently. Disability is the essence of diversity by definition. It runs across race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomics, culture, and the most important thing, It's the only minority group anyone can join at any time, which makes it unique. That's Jonathan Kaufman in Source America 2020. An inclusive future of work was the paper. And I think this is really important because when our faculty say we don't have any students with disabilities, I don't know anyone with a disability, they're not realizing that 27% of people have a disability. The vast majority of those are non-apparent, or you could say hidden or invisible. I prefer non-apparent, but it's also the minority group that anyone can join due to accident, illness, injury, or they add aging. So it wasn't a group I expected to join a long time ago, but I think it's important to realize that that's why it matters. Thanks, Mel.
Thank you, Sarah. My name is Mel Rizzuto. And my visual description, before I forget, is I am a white cisgender female with medium length brown hair. I am wearing a yellow floral V-neck shirt. And as Sarah mentioned, I'm recovering from double pink eye and a cold. So if my voice is a little scratchy and my eyes are a little red, that is what I'm dealing with today. But I'm very happy this presentation was at the end of the week, so it gave me an extra couple days to bounce back and prepare. So mathematics is a gate and a key to science. And the role of math in STEM fields simply cannot be understated. Math has been called the universal language, and it's both a language and a tool in STEM fields. Like any other language, mathematics has its own set of vocabulary, punctuation, spelling, grammar, cultural norms and assumptions, and of course, symbolism. So while mathematics is foundational to the engineering field, the focus of accessibility in general across the board has always been on the written word and often overlooks the information that is conveyed in an equation. Have you ever considered how much information you can glean from even a quick glance at an equation? If you're familiar with the content, you can quickly use visual context clues to form a rough picture, mental image of that equation in your mind. The visual clues usually give you a sense of the length and the complexity, including the hierarchy of an equation, which is often difficult to grasp in just an auditory version of the same equation. So even with the symbolic version of an equation being read aloud, it can sometimes be difficult to grasp without appropriate mathematical punctuation. So keeping with visual, it's also important to note that on our slide, the use of color to convey information does not work for colorblind individuals, and the same goes with math. In the case on just this slide, we used a red box that's, kind of bolded and emphasized to highlight using a shape versus just changing the color of the word visual for emphasis. You're probably familiar with that from just a lot of the textual accessibility, digital accessibility efforts. So keeping with visual, we just want to touch briefly on the challenges of visual mathematics and give you an example from real experience in one of our, in our real courses. So an unexpected and rather unfortunate side effect of these efforts to make math more accessible is that sometimes our tools just don't work. They produce glitches, and that negatively impacts the visual math that is shown. And this one, for example, is a challenge in the use of a format called MathType, which specifically demonstrates why there is a need to verify whether equations are visually correct for students who are not using a screen reader. So we're talking about the visual aspect. Many of us think about the screen reader part, but are those two aspects in sync? This equation, again, was created in MathType in a PowerPoint file. But this screenshot of that equation was captured when using a Chrome browser. So the equation would be read aloud correctly by a screen reader because it's using math type, which is MathML. However, the brackets, as you can see on the screen, are just, in the denominator are not visually correct. When they're viewed by the browser, the students who were looking at the slides reported them because the content was correct in the auditory version, but if they printed and downloaded a PDF of these slides, they were seeing kind of a gobbly mess. What we found is that a lot of brackets, matrices, and vector symbols can appear incorrectly in PowerPoint and PDFs that are created from those PowerPoints in various browsers. And to explain that a little further, sometimes this happens in a preview version of a PDF or PowerPoint file. So if you're using Canvas, for example, I'm sure they all do this. There's a little, you can have a preview of the file and it shows the slides really quickly or the notes. And this is something that was showing there, but if you had downloaded the file and opened it in a PowerPoint desktop, it was not. So there's those discrepancies that happen. Unfortunately, we don't actually have a very definitive answer on which combinations of these programs and equipment create the most correct versions of symbols and some that don't. So we're constantly, revising our guidelines based on our own trial and error with various tools. Katie will show a little bit more about that. But in the meantime, we just suggest it's best to provide multiple means of viewing the content. I think someone in the chat alluded to that. And for example, in this case, we ended up with a PDF and a PowerPoint and a Canvas page that had accessible MathML. Moving on from the visual, auditory information is also conveyed in an equation. And the challenges of auditory math impact the accuracy of math for anyone who is listening to those equations in lectures or using assistive technology such as a screen reader or immersive reader. So we'll introduce the content that might be missed when you're listening to equations that are spoken aloud. Oh yeah, for context, let's consider the following quote, excuse me, from blind mathematician, and he's also a higher ed faculty and a scientist for the government, Albert Minneke. This quote came from an interview about his life as a blind mathematician, where he shared his challenges of listening to mathematics equations being read aloud. While he was able to stop and, you can stop and ask a live reader or live presentation for clarification, he shared that the challenges of using a screen reader or a recorded audio book of a textbook or a test, he didn't have that option. So I'm just quoting Albert in this portion. In the case of recorded materials, the ambiguities became a guessing game. For fractions, where exactly was the break between numerator and denominator? For exponents, what specific quantity did the exponent cover? Or if the exponent was a long expression, where did it end? And what did one do with the exponents and of the exponents? So you can see there's layers. Functions of more than one variable also presented their own difficulties, especially when the variables were themselves expressions of other variables. One instructive task in listening to recorded material is to be found in developing the ability to consider possible interpretations of that reading and to eliminate those that make no sense in the context of the parts that do make sense. And this type of forced listening was excellent training for me, although it was time-consuming and often frustrating. So we share that quote, and I know it's a little long, and I read it out loud. So when you get the notes from this presentation, you'll have the full quote, just a snippet on the slide there. But it just really gets to the types of challenges facing not only our students, but also faculty and professionals in the field of engineering. Okay, now we're going to do a quick activity to form a mental image of an equation. Consider for a moment the written descriptions of an equation. This would be something like an alt text. And what do you picture in your mind as I read aloud each version and display the text on the screen? The first one, 2 plus 3 over 4x equals x minus 3 over 4. Okay, get your mental picture for that one. And now 2 plus the fraction 3 divided by 4x equals x minus the fraction 3 divided by 4. Okay, so do you have a mental image? Maybe you jotted something down. You probably realize there's a fraction or two in that expression, but you may or may not have been able to determine what was the numerator, what was the denominator. And this is an example of what problems might assistive technology encounter when reading an equation that was written either as inline text and not recognized as math, or a screen reader reciting alternative text for an image. Another example that's really common is you might see something like 4IN period, and that might be spoken. But is IN being read as the opposite of out, or is it 4 inches? So we take a lot of these shortcuts, and our faculty certainly do the same thing in their production of instructional content. And so if you're only listening to an equation, you're missing out when the speaker says over, under, and any other non-specific mathematical language. Next, we have a brief screen reader demonstration. And so on this slide, I have 2 recordings of a screen reader reading 2 versions of the same equation. The first is inaccessible, and I'll play that one. Actually, I hope I set the share up properly. Let me see. I don't remember if I checked the box, so we'll find out. Oh. No.
No, I'm not getting it, Mel.
Yeah, let me unshare that. Is that a word? Unshare. And share again. Optimize. There we go. Oh, did I share the right screen? No. On the fly. Here we go.
Let's give it as your desktop and slide notes, Mel.
Yeah, it's all good. All right. Take 2.
2 plus 3 4 equals minus 3 4.
Did you hear that? I can't see you guys, so let me know.
Yes, all good.
Okay. So did you notice that that first example left out the variable x? So a screen reader would have an inaccurate equation being read to the person listening. The second version is accessible, and
2 plus 3 fourths x equals x minus 3 fourths.
okay, so that one read the equation as it should be read out loud. And just another note, these screen reader demos were created with 2 different versions. So one, they were recorded with NVDA, but this might sound different if you were using the Canvas or Microsoft Immersive Reader or JAWS or another system. So there's so much variation in what can happen. And now Katie will discuss another factor in creating equations that we need to consider.
All right, thanks, Mel. Hello, everyone. My name's Katie Springer. My visual description is I'm a white cisgender woman with about shoulder-length brown hair. I'm wearing a black shirt and glasses, and I apologize if my cat gets in the way and distracts me as I do this section, but she just woke up. On this slide, what we have is the symbolic version of that same equation, and it's included here as an image with alt text. So we've also included the LaTeX code that could be used in a math tool like Equatio or MathType to create the equation shown here. We'll mention those languages in greater detail in just a few slides, but the key here is that it is important for subject matter experts to verify the accuracy of symbols in an equation. In our own experience, we've found a variety of symbol errors can be generated with various equation editors when they interact with available fonts in a browser. We showed you the MathType example earlier with the brackets. We even had one instance where Greek letters were showing up as bicycle symbols in pianos one time. And as certainly as support staff, if we're remediating content, we might confuse A for alpha and vice versa. So all of those reasons combined, your math needs to be checked by the SME. And certainly using LaTeX or MathML that I'll cover in just a couple slides, typesetting and markup languages that allow you to author more precise equations that clearly designate what the numerator and denominator is, sure, but also alpha versus A, etc. That allows us to author equations with accurate symbolic representations. Next slide, please. All right, so when we consider math as a language like any other, we pay attention to the punctuation and the grammar. And the visual representation of an equation conveys punctuation that can be lost in alt text descriptions of math images. So it's important to be explicit with math punctuation in video descriptions as to support all students. So some of the recommendations that we have here are to be explicit when you're speaking, because that becomes the captions and transcripts for your videos. When speaking, use inflection to emphasize or pauses to emphasize to give the listener context clues. Just remember that that inflection is lost in captions. And then when you're creating alt text for images of equations, explicitly name symbols, groupings, hierarchies. And that means using proper mathematical terms that we've talked about, like saying divided by instead of over. What we're aiming for is clear math in spoken lectures, as well as in captions and with assistive technology. So that means that all students, if they're listening to the lecture, reading the transcripts, or reading alternative text, should be able to understand the math. So how do you know what content needs to be in an accessible equation format and what could be typed as plain text? Pretty much universally, we recommend avoiding plain text equations. But with the examples here, consider how equations, math symbols, and units are read when they're mistaken for simple text and not recognized as math. Is this second line F equals ma or force equals mass times acceleration? If it's written in plain text, it will not be read according to how you mean this equation to be interpreted. And also consider multiplication symbols that are commonly used by mathematicians that wouldn't necessarily be read correctly by a screen reader, or even a student who's just not familiar with that type of notation. So an asterisk using the letter X instead of the multiplication symbol, all of those may or may not make sense to the reader who doesn't have the visual context or can't ask you for clarification in real time. And lastly, also consider functions, matrices, and vectors, which are frequently read incorrectly when they appear as text to a human reader or a screen reader unfamiliar with the context. So now that we've established math as a component of STEM equity and looked at challenges of accurately conveying math as a language, we're going to dive into technical aspects of accessible equation creation specifically the math languages I've mentioned, and some tools that can allow your equations to be recognized and read accurately by assistive technology like screen readers. So there are two main math languages that we'll discuss. The first here is MathML. It's a markup language for encoding math content. It's very similar to HTML, and it will appear within your HTML when you use it. This uses tags to mark up the visual display and the mathematical semantics of your equations. It provides access to the visual representation and the meaning of equations for assistive technology. We recommend this for complex equations because it allows users of screen readers to take a deeper dive into the structure of equations using keyboard navigation. And if you, I think one more click, Mel. Yep. So LaTeX is a typesetting language that uses only keyboard characters to convey math notation. It can be used as an input to various equation editors, including the Canvas equation editor. And you can also use other authoring options to generate LaTeX, and I'll go over that in a second. But the key thing here is that neither of these languages on their own is accessible. They need to be used within a tool that provides an accessible experience. So for instance, Canvas correctly renders both LaTeX and MathML equations, and they can be read by a screen reader or by the Canvas immersive reader. But without MathType, Canvas, Equatio, tools like that, and MathML and LaTeX simply are code. And since we don't normally read a web page by reading the HTML, we need to provide accessible math in an appropriate encoding and rendering environment. So that means we need to review our tool options. This is a table that we created last year to serve as a decision tree for our faculty and staff to choose the best option for various course material formats. I want to caveat this table by saying that accessible math is definitely not always straightforward, and our statements as far as something being accessible or not accessible on this table are based on the tools that we have available at Hopkins and how we use them. So that is with desktop versions of Word and PowerPoint, and using desktop versions of Equatio and MathType. So other combinations of browser versions or add-in versions of those equation tools, unfortunately, may have different outcomes. But to give you the highlights and overview of this version of the table, we've broken down by Canvas, PowerPoint, and so on, and the accessibility of these various languages and tools. The native Canvas equation editor uses LaTeX, and the Canvas HTML editor, like I mentioned, correctly renders LaTeX or MathML. The built-in Microsoft equation editor in PowerPoint is not accessible, so you would need to use another tool like Equatio that creates an image with alt text, or MathType that creates equations based in MathML. The built-in editor in Word, however, allows you to type and render LaTeX. It is accessible, but you could also swap out and use a tool like Equatio or MathType. PDFs generally are inaccessible, and an option, therefore, you could be a tool like Equatio that gives you an image with alt text that works for simple equations. Our best practice, I believe Mel mentioned this earlier, if we're using MathType on something, we would provide the PDF because some students and some faculty prefer that, and then also provide, say, the PowerPoint file so that the MathType and MathML is available for screen reader users. And in this table, you can see that we highlight equatio as something that can be used, especially in remediation, to go from one format to another. If you want to generate LaTeX, generate MathML, and then paste it into whatever final format you want to use, it can be a great tool for that. MathPix is something similar that could be a great tool for that. That actually leads me into this table has been expanded upon since last year. There was a session earlier this week on Wednesday led by Bayun Chen, who I see is here in this session, Tian Tian and Kylie Woodland from UCF. We definitely encourage you to watch that recording. And if you'd like more information on math tools, you can reach out to any of us. They did do a demo of MathPix. And I actually wanted to go ahead and drop in. Okay, Sarah did it for me. Awesome. So that's the link to a revised version of this table, and we're still working on that. I'm sure as we continue to collaborate, that will evolve and expand possibly to other tools as well. But the main thing I want to highlight before we move on to the next slide is that by specifically saying the individual capabilities of these languages and tools, what we're hoping is that this gives you a kind of checklist for identifying other potential math tools that would give you accessible equations and you could use if these tools aren't available to you. Okay, 10 minutes left. We're almost done. I really have just one last slide of content. This is the last thing I want to say before we wrap things up, is just to consider also the possibility of doing a direct file conversion from one format to another. That's something that we've started doing within the past year using software called Pandoc. Have a link for that as well. This allows you to, our example here, we use it for going from a LaTeX file. And the command example is asking for the conversion of a Lecture 7 LaTeX file, convert that to HTML, and then I'm also asking it to convert all the equations that were originally in LaTeX, convert that to MathML. And the final output that we get in that conversion is an HTML file. I can copy all of that, paste it onto a Canvas page, do some minor tweaking, especially with headings, just to make sure that they start on a heading 2 and so on. And that gives us a fairly accessible Canvas page. There are many other conversion options that Pandoc is able to do. So definitely give that a look. And Pandoc is completely free. So it's a little bit intimidating when you first start to use it, but once you figure it out, it can be a great tool to have. So on our last slide here, we just want to emphasize that we do not have all the answers. There's no gold standard and no perfectly accessible way to present math, but we're continuing to learn new things every day, continuing to evolve our recommendations. So if you have any questions, definitely reach out to us. But if you have other experiences or recommendations, we'd appreciate you sharing that as well.
I think this is one of my favorite quotes. This is Sarah speaking again. The one argument for accessibility that doesn't get made nearly often enough is how extraordinarily better it makes some people's lives. How many opportunities do we have to dramatically improve people's lives just by doing our job a little bit better? That's from Steve Krug. So as Katie said, and I know Bayun just put her contact information in the chat as well, we would love to hear from you. Mel, if you want to go on to the next one, that's got our emails. And then if you look at our actual slide deck, there's several other resources that we have linked in there. And I'm a research hoarder, so we have plenty of references as well. So I think if there are any questions.
I realize a Friday afternoon, very dense math presentation has probably got you all in a little bit of a daze, but
I'm going to throw a
feel
couple
free to
links in
reach
the
out
chat.
again.
We have an article in our Faculty Forward magazine, which is online, which has, it's our math accessibility article, but it also has links at the bottom to our other recorded workshops on math. So if you have faculty that you want to point to why this matters, you're welcome to send them there. And there's a keynote that Zach Latin did last year that I really love, called Arbitrarily Close to Access in STEM at the Athens conference. And that's a really good demonstration of a screen reader and why it's important for people to be able to dive down into a equation. And it's a really good analogy for accessibility and how hard it is to get it perfect, but sometimes making the effort is definitely worth it.
A question in the chat is if there's a best way to represent multiplication in an equation, either x or parentheses. And I think it was just answered in the chat also.
I don't know if I have a definitive answer on that because I would say it depends. It depends on whether it's going to be read correctly, viewed correctly, if it would be assumed by students to know it, or if it's a more complex equation. And
Yeah, and certainly one of the nuances to this also is, if there's a faculty member and they're planning to utilize a certain plain text format to indicate multiplication, that could be something they explain up front. So it would be something that early on in the course, and then reminding students as the lectures go, or as the conversation continues, so that if you are planning to use a small x or an asterisk, if it's being read directly as plain text from a screen reader, the student would then have to account for that when they're listening. So it's certainly possible. However, when you're asking for the best way, then that would be certainly to use the proper equation tools.
our math accessibility article also links back to some of our earlier articles because we have an ongoing column in our Faculty Forward magazine about disability inclusion and why that matters. So I had written an article about why I wouldn't say, or why I was hesitant to say disabled engineer or disabled faculty member. That's the one called Disability as Diversity. So you can get to those links either through our slides, but also through that math accessibility article. And the latest one in that series is called Humanizing Online Learning, where we talked about inclusive teaching. And I have an interview on there, a video with one of my space systems faculty and my own instructional designer about why we talk to students about accessibility, because students are the future workforce in STEM. And since our students are largely working professionals, what they learn about accessibility in our classes, they're taking back to the workforce now. So we're seeing a big ripple effect from that, which we really love.
Another question in the chat is if you could tell us a little bit about your faculty development or course design process at your college, with a question of how you handle the division of work to make sure that all of your engineering courses are accessible.
Unfortunately, right now, we're still in the retrofit on a lot of our courses, which comes from Jay Dolmage's book, Academic Ableism, the Steep Steps, the Retrofit, and Universal Design. But we are now developing newer courses, which are going to be accessible from the start, which I think we really love. Katie and Mel and I are working a lot on math accessibility in order to get the procedures down that we can share with our faculty to make it both efficient and correct. So LaTeX is something new to us. We're providing our faculty with the different tools and then having this conversation about what is your course, what kinds of math do you have in your class, like which would be the best tools. I have a course called Physics of Space Security. And so he started developing content in PowerPoint equation editor. And so we had a conversation about how you need to create this accessibly from the start. So creating those Canvas pages using math type, because his math is more like a lot more hierarchy. Math intense is our affectionate word for that. So Equasio wouldn't be the best tool. So if you used PowerPoint equation editor, you're going to have to go back and convert that somehow. So let's be efficient and use that from the beginning. So it's a one-on-one conversation, I think, with our faculty at this point.
Yeah, and just to reiterate the faculty development aspect, which includes the resources that Sarah has been sharing, but we have presented similar presentations to our own faculty. Usually it's split up into, 1, 2, or 3 sessions. We've been invited to larger faculty meetings and program meetings. And so while most of it is, ID with faculty consulting one-on-one, we are trying to, it's very much a change management effort in that we, want to educate faculty and other professionals in our own department about how this could be done. And we're working in, groups to fine tune our process, collaborating with other institutions like with Bayun and someone from Texas A&M. And we keep growing and expanding that list of collaborators, but it's an ongoing effort. And also, just because you asked about the division of workload, we also have Katie's role as a course support specialist, and I was in that role previously as well, where when we are retrofitting, we're working together to convert, materials that instructors have provided us so that we can help speed up the process. But as Sarah said, we are hopefully becoming more proactive as new courses come online.
Thank you so much. That puts us to the end of the session. This was so great. There's the code for the treasure hunt is in the chat if anyone is still playing. And I'm sure we will continue this conversation as the collaboration intensifies.
Thank you all for attending. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be back in 15 minutes for a student panel in, I think, the other Zoom. So, a little bit of a break.